The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Windsor Castle as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, walked slowly through the corridors she had come to know so well over the years. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ancient walls, each step carrying the weight of a decision that had been growing in her heart for months. Today was different from all the other days she had spent within these royal walls. Today, she had made up her mind about something that would change everything. Catherine paused at a tall window overlooking the castle gardens, where autumn leaves danced in the crisp October breeze. The gardens reminded her of Diana, whose love for these very grounds had been legendary among the palace staff. Stories of the late Princess of Wales walking these paths, picking flowers, and finding peace among the roses had been shared with Catherine many times over the years. Each tale had painted a picture of a woman who had found solace in nature, even when the pressures of royal life became overwhelming. The weight of her own royal duties had been pressing down on Catherine more heavily recently. The constant public appearances, the endless charity events, the careful balance between being a mother and being a princess, it all felt like a heavy cloak that she could never remove. She understood now, more than ever, why Diana had sometimes struggled with the golden cage of royal life. The similarities between their experiences were not lost on Catherine, and she often found herself wondering how Diana had managed to maintain her grace under such intense scrutiny. As she continued walking through the castle, Catherine's mind wandered to the conversation she had had with William the night before. They had been discussing their upcoming state visit to Australia, and William had mentioned how proud he was of how she had grown into her role as Princess of Wales. His words had been meant as encouragement, but they had stirred something deep within her, a longing to connect more meaningfully with Diana's legacy, to honor the woman whose title she now carried. The castle was quieter than usual this morning. King Charles was in his study, preparing for a meeting with his private secretary about upcoming engagements. The staff moved about their duties with the practiced silence that came from years of service to the crown. Catherine appreciated these moments of relative peace, when she could think clearly without the constant buzz of activity that usually surrounded royal life. She made her way toward the East Wing, where many of the royal family's most precious possessions were kept. The corridor she entered was lined with portraits of previous monarchs and their families, their painted eyes seeming to watch her as she passed. Among them hung several pictures of Diana, captured in various moments of her royal career. Catherine always felt a complex mix of emotions when she saw these images: admiration, sadness, and sometimes a strange sense of connection to a woman she had never met but whose path she now followed. The room Catherine sought was at the end of this corridor. It was officially known as the Royal Collection Storage, but everyone in the family simply called it the treasure room. Inside were countless pieces of jewelry, artifacts, and personal items that had belonged to various members of the royal family over the centuries. Some pieces were displayed in museums, others were worn for state occasions, but many remained here, carefully preserved and catalogued, waiting for the right moment to see daylight again. Catherine had visited this room many times before, usually accompanied by a member of the royal household staff when she needed to select jewelry for formal events. But today was different. Today she had come alone, with a specific purpose that she hadn't shared with anyone, not even William. The heavy wooden door opened with a soft creak, and Catherine stepped inside. The room was climate-controlled and dimly lit, with glass cases lining the walls and elegant display stands positioned throughout the space. Each piece had its own story, its own connection to royal history. Catherine had always been fascinated by these objects and the lives they had touched. She moved purposefully through the room, past cases containing tiaras worn by Queen Elizabeth, past brooches that had belonged to Queen Victoria, past rings that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies. Her destination was a particular case near the back of the room, one she had visited many times but always with other people present. Today, she wanted to be alone with her thoughts and with the memory of the woman these pieces had belonged to. The case contained Diana's personal jewelry collection, pieces she had chosen herself, pieces that had meant something special to her beyond their monetary value. Among them were earrings she had worn to charity galas, bracelets that had adorned her wrists during private family moments, and several necklaces that had become part of her signature style. Catherine's eyes were drawn immediately to one particular piece, a stunning sapphire and diamond necklace that Diana had worn on several memorable occasions. The necklace was elegant but not overpowering, sophisticated yet somehow accessible. It perfectly embodied Diana's approach to royal fashion, regal enough for a princess, but approachable enough for the people's princess. As Catherine gazed at the necklace, memories flooded back of all the times she had seen Diana wearing it in photographs and videos. She remembered the way it had caught the light during Diana's famous interview, how it had complemented her evening gowns at state dinners, how it had seemed to give her an extra touch of confidence during difficult public appearances. The more Catherine looked at the necklace, the more she felt drawn to it. It wasn't just about the beauty of the piece itself, though it was undeniably stunning. It was about what it represented. This necklace had been chosen by Diana, worn by Diana, loved by Diana. It carried with it all the hopes, dreams, and struggles of a woman who had tried to modernize the monarchy while remaining true to herself. Catherine found herself imagining what it would be like to wear this piece. Not for the glamour or the prestige, but for the connection it would create to Diana's memory. She had always felt the weight of following in Diana's footsteps, but she had also felt somewhat distant from her predecessor. Wearing something that had been so personal to Diana seemed like it might bridge that gap, creating a tangible link between past and present. The room was so quiet that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat as she stood before the case. She thought about all the times people had compared her to Diana, sometimes favorably, sometimes not. She had always tried to forge her own path as Princess of Wales, but she couldn't deny that Diana's shadow loomed large over everything she did. Perhaps embracing that connection, rather than trying to escape it, was exactly what she needed to do. Catherine's phone buzzed softly in her purse, reminding her that she had other obligations waiting. But she couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. There was something about this moment, standing alone with Diana's treasures, that felt significant. It felt like a turning point, though she wasn't entirely sure toward what. She thought about her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and how they would someday learn about their grandmother Diana. What stories would she tell them? What memories could she share when she had no personal memories of Diana to draw upon? Perhaps having something tangible, something that had been part of Diana's life, would help her feel more qualified to pass on Diana's legacy to the next generation. The necklace seemed to shimmer in the soft lighting of the room, as if it were calling to her. Catherine had never believed in signs or omens, but there was something almost magical about this moment. She felt as though Diana herself might be present in the room, giving her blessing for what Catherine was contemplating. As she continued to stare at the necklace, Catherine began to formulate a plan. She would speak to Charles about borrowing the piece, not just for a single event, but for an extended period. She would explain her feelings about connecting with Diana's memory, about honoring the legacy of the Princess of Wales title. Surely he would understand. After all, he had loved Diana too, despite everything that had happened between them. Catherine imagined wearing the necklace to upcoming royal engagements. She pictured how it would look with her various outfits, how it might make her feel more connected to the role she had inherited. She thought about the photographers who would capture images of her wearing Diana's necklace, and how those images might help the public see the continuity between past and present. But, even as these thoughts excited her, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. Royal protocol was strict about such things. There were procedures to follow, permissions to seek, considerations to weigh. Nothing in the royal family was ever simple, especially when it involved anything connected to Diana's memory. Catherine knew that Diana's jewelry was a sensitive subject within the family. Some pieces had been given to William and Harry after their mother's death, but others remained in the royal collection, available for special occasions but not for personal use. The line between official royal jewelry and personal inheritance was sometimes blurry, and Catherine had always been careful not to overstep any boundaries. Still, as she looked at the necklace, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was meant to be. Diana had been gone for so many years now, but her influence on the monarchy and on the British people remained strong. Catherine had often felt the pressure of living up to Diana's memory, of being compared to a woman who had achieved iconic status. Perhaps wearing something that had been Diana's would help her feel more worthy of those comparisons. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Catherine realize how long she had been standing in the room. She glanced at her watch and saw that nearly an hour had passed since she had first entered. Time seemed to move differently in this space, surrounded by so much history and memory. As the footsteps faded away, Catherine made her decision. She would approach Charles about the necklace today. She would explain her feelings, her desire to honor Diana's memory, her belief that wearing the piece would help her serve the crown more effectively. She had always been able to speak openly with her father-in-law, and she hoped that this conversation would be no different. Catherine took one last look at the necklace before turning to leave the room. As she walked back through the corridors of Windsor Castle, her mind was already racing with thoughts of how to approach Charles, what words to use, how to make him understand the depth of her feelings about this request. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, casting different patterns of light and shadow throughout the castle. Catherine felt as though she was walking toward a new chapter in her royal life, one where she would no longer feel like an outsider looking in on Diana's legacy, but rather a true inheritor of everything that the title Princess of Wales represented. She had no way of knowing that her simple request would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundations of the royal family, or that by evening, the entire palace would be talking about what had happened when she finally found the courage to ask for what she wanted most. Catherine found King Charles in his private study, surrounded by the familiar chaos of papers, books, and correspondence that seemed to follow him everywhere. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Charles looked up from his reading as she entered, his face brightening with the warm smile he always reserved for his daughter-in-law. "Catherine, my dear," he said, removing his reading glasses and setting aside what appeared to be a lengthy briefing document. "What brings you to my sanctuary this afternoon? You look rather serious." Catherine had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times during the walk from the treasure room to Charles's study, but now that she was actually standing before him, the words seemed to stick in her throat. There was something about the weight of what she was asking that made her suddenly nervous, despite the years of comfortable relationship she had built with Charles. "I wanted to speak with you about something personal," she began, taking the seat Charles gestured toward across from his desk. The leather chair was well worn and comfortable, a piece that had probably been in this study for decades. "It's about Diana's jewelry collection." Charles's expression didn't change, but Catherine noticed a subtle shift in his posture. Anything related to Diana still carried emotional weight within the family, even after all these years. The king had worked hard to heal the wounds left by his first marriage, but certain topics could still stir up complicated feelings. "Of course," Charles said carefully. "What specifically did you want to discuss?" Catherine took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot lately about my role as Princess of Wales, and about Diana's legacy. I know that sounds rather obvious, but it's been weighing on me more heavily recently. I feel like I'm constantly being compared to her, and, while I've tried to forge my own path, I think I may have been too focused on being different rather than honoring what came before." Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. This was a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as his thinking pose, the way he positioned himself when he was carefully considering his response. "You've done wonderfully in your role, Catherine," he said gently. "I hope you know how proud we all are of how you've grown into the position. Diana would be proud too, I'm certain of that." The mention of Diana's hypothetical approval gave Catherine the opening she needed. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I spent some time in the collection room this morning, looking at some of her pieces, and I found myself particularly drawn to her sapphire and diamond necklace, the one she wore to so many memorable events." Charles's eyes flickered with recognition. He knew the piece well, had probably been present when Diana had first worn it to various royal functions. Catherine could see memories playing across his features as he recalled his first wife and that particular jewelry. "It's a beautiful piece," Charles acknowledged. One of her favorites, actually. She always said it made her feel confident when she wore it. That's exactly why I wanted to speak with you, Catherine said, leaning forward slightly. I've been feeling somewhat disconnected from Diana's memory lately, despite carrying her title. I think wearing something that was so meaningful to her might help me feel more worthy of the comparisons that are constantly being made. It might help me honor her legacy more authentically. Charles was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. As king, he had to consider not just the emotional aspects of her request, but also the protocol implications, the public relations ramifications, and the potential family dynamics that could be affected. You want to borrow the necklace for a specific event? He asked. Catherine shook her head. Not just for one event. I was hoping I might be able to wear it more regularly, to important engagements, state functions, charity galas. I think it would send a powerful message about continuity, about respecting Diana's contribution to the monarchy while moving forward into the future. Charles stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. This was another familiar gesture, one he employed when he needed to think through complex situations. Catherine waited patiently, knowing that rushing him would not help her cause. Catherine, he said finally, still looking out at the gardens, I appreciate what you're trying to do, and I understand the sentiment behind it. But, you must understand that Diana's jewelry is a very sensitive matter within the family. There are protocols in place, traditions that govern how these pieces are handled. Catherine felt her heart sink slightly, but she pressed on. I do understand the sensitivity, truly. But, I also think this could be an opportunity to heal some old wounds, to show the public that we honor Diana's memory rather than trying to erase it. Charles turned back to face her, and Catherine could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. He was a man who valued tradition and protocol above almost everything else, but he was also someone who had learned to appreciate the importance of public perception and emotional intelligence in modern monarchy. The necklace you're referring to, Charles said slowly, was actually a gift from the Spencer family. It belonged to Diana before her marriage, which complicates matters somewhat. While it became part of the royal collection after her death, there are questions about whether it should properly be considered a family heirloom or personal property. This was information Catherine hadn't known, and it added a new layer of complexity to her request. The Spencer family's involvement meant that there were additional considerations beyond just royal protocol. I hadn't realized, Catherine admitted. But surely that makes it even more meaningful? It was something Diana chose to bring into the royal family, something that represented her personal taste and style. Charles returned to his desk but didn't sit down. Instead, he began pacing slowly around the room, a habit Catherine had noticed he employed when dealing with particularly thorny issues. There's also William and Harry to consider, Charles continued. Both of them have feelings about their mother's belongings, and any decisions about Diana's jewelry affect them as well. William chose to give you Diana's engagement ring, which was a beautiful gesture and entirely appropriate. But other pieces, well, it's more complicated. Catherine hadn't fully considered how William might react to her request. She had assumed he would support her desire to honor his mother's memory, but now she wondered if he might see it differently. Would he think she was trying to replace Diana rather than honor her? Would Harry feel excluded from decisions about their mother's possessions? Perhaps I should speak with William first, Catherine suggested. Get his thoughts on the matter before we go any further. Charles stopped pacing and looked at her directly. That might be wise. But, Catherine, I want you to understand something important. Your worth as Princess of Wales doesn't depend on wearing Diana's jewelry. You've created your own legacy, your own relationship with the British people. Trying to capture Diana's magic through her possessions might actually diminish what you've already accomplished. His words were gentle but firm, and Catherine could hear genuine concern in his voice. She realized that part of what she was asking might be interpreted as insecurity about her own position, rather than respect for Diana's memory. I don't want to diminish anything I've done, Catherine said carefully. I just think there's value in showing continuity, in demonstrating that Diana's contributions haven't been forgotten or dismissed. No one has forgotten Diana's contributions, Charles replied, his voice taking on a slight edge. But the monarchy must move forward, not backward. We honor the past by building upon it, not by trying to recreate it. Catherine sensed that she was losing ground in this conversation, but she wasn't ready to give up entirely. There was something about this necklace that called to her, something that felt important beyond just the desire to connect with Diana's memory. What if it were just for special occasions, she offered as a compromise? State dinners, major charity events, moments when the symbolism would be particularly meaningful? Charles sighed deeply, and Catherine could see the weight of kingship in his expression. Every decision he made had ramifications that extended far beyond the immediate moment, and she was asking him to make a choice that could affect family relationships, public perception, and royal protocol all at once. Catherine, I need you to understand something about Diana's jewelry, Charles said, returning to his chair. When she died, there were many difficult conversations about what should happen to her personal belongings. Some pieces went to her sons, others remained with the royal collection, and still others were returned to her family. Each decision was carefully considered and often painful to make. Catherine nodded, beginning to understand the deeper complexities she had stumbled into. The necklace you're interested in was one of the pieces that caused considerable discussion, Charles continued. Harry had expressed interest in it, but ultimately it was decided that it should remain in the royal collection for potential future use. If I were to give it to you now, it might reopen old wounds that we've worked very hard to heal. This revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had no idea that Harry might have wanted the necklace for himself, perhaps to give to his own wife someday. Her request suddenly seemed selfish and inconsiderate, driven by her own needs rather than respect for the family's complex dynamics. I had no idea about Harry's feelings, Catherine said quietly. I would never want to cause any pain or conflict within the family. Charles's expression softened. I know you wouldn't, my dear. Your heart is in the right place, and I can see how much thought you've put into this. But sometimes the right intentions can lead us into complicated territory. Catherine felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, though she tried to maintain her composure. This conversation wasn't going at all the way she had hoped, and she was beginning to feel foolish for even bringing up the subject. Perhaps, Charles said gently, there might be other ways to honor Diana's memory that wouldn't involve such sensitive territory. There are pieces in the collection that don't carry the same emotional weight, items that could achieve the symbolic connection you're seeking without opening old wounds. Catherine appreciated his attempt to find a middle ground, but she knew that no other piece would feel the same as the sapphire necklace. It wasn't just about wearing something that had belonged to Diana, it was specifically about that necklace, with its particular history and significance. I understand, Catherine said finally, though her voice carried the weight of disappointment. I don't want to cause any problems for the family. Perhaps I was being naive about how simple this request might be. Charles stood and walked around his desk to place a gentle hand on Catherine's shoulder. You weren't being naive, and your instincts about honoring Diana's legacy are correct. But, in royal life, even the most well-intentioned actions can have unintended consequences. It's one of the more difficult aspects of this life we've all chosen. As Catherine prepared to leave Charles's study, she felt a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Disappointment at not getting what she had hoped for, embarrassment at not having considered all the implications of her request, but also a grudging respect for Charles's careful consideration of all the factors involved. Thank you for listening, she said as she reached the door. And thank you for explaining everything so patiently. I obviously have a lot more to learn about navigating these kinds of situations. Charles smiled warmly. We all continue learning, Catherine. The day we stop learning is the day we stop growing. Your desire to connect with Diana's memory shows how seriously you take your role, and that's commendable. As Catherine walked back through the corridors of Windsor Castle, her mind was already turning to other possibilities. If she couldn't have Diana's necklace, perhaps there were other ways to honor the late princess's memory. Maybe Charles was right that she needed to focus on building her own legacy rather than trying to recapture someone else's. But, even as she tried to accept the wisdom in Charles's words, part of her couldn't let go of the image of that sapphire necklace, gleaming in its case, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Catherine couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed beside William, listening to his steady breathing while her mind churned with thoughts about her conversation with Charles. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that sapphire necklace, and every time she opened them, she felt the weight of disappointment settling heavier on her chest. The clock on the bedside table showed 3:47 a.m. when Catherine finally gave up on sleep altogether. She slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to disturb William, and padded barefoot to the window seat that overlooked the private gardens of their Kensington Palace apartment. The London night was unusually clear, with stars visible despite the city lights, and Catherine found herself thinking about Diana again. How many nights had Diana spent awake like this, wrestling with the complexities of royal life? How many times had she stared out windows, feeling trapped by protocol and tradition? Catherine had read every biography, watched every documentary, studied every interview, but she was beginning to understand that no amount of research could truly prepare someone for the reality of living within the royal system. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Catherine's mood perfectly. She went through her usual routine mechanically: shower, breakfast with the children, reviewing the day's schedule with her private secretary, but her heart wasn't in any of it. Even George noticed that something was off, asking her twice during breakfast if she was feeling all right. "Just tired, sweetheart," Catherine had replied, forcing a smile that she hoped looked more convincing than it felt. The day's first engagement was a visit to a children's hospital in East London, something Catherine normally would have looked forward to. Working with children had always been one of the most fulfilling aspects of her royal duties, and she genuinely enjoyed these visits. But, today, even the thought of the cameras and questions from the press felt overwhelming. As her car pulled up to the hospital, Catherine could see the familiar cluster of photographers and reporters waiting outside. She took a deep breath, put on her public smile, and stepped out of the vehicle with the practiced grace that had become second nature over the years. The visit proceeded smoothly on the surface. Catherine spoke with doctors and nurses, played with young patients, and participated in a ceremony to open a new pediatric wing. But, throughout it all, she felt like she was watching herself from a distance, going through the motions without really being present. It was during a quiet moment, while she was reading to a group of children in the hospital's library, that Catherine had what could only be described as an epiphany. One little girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, asked her if she was a real princess. "Yes, I am," Catherine had replied automatically. "Do you have a crown?" the little girl continued, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Sometimes I wear one, for very special occasions." "What about a magic necklace?" "Real princesses always have magic necklaces." The innocent question hit Catherine like a thunderbolt. Here was this child, seeing her as a fairy tale princess, complete with all the magical accessories that made a princess special. And, suddenly, Catherine understood that her desire for Diana's necklace wasn't really about honoring the past, it was about feeling legitimate in her role, about having that magical something that would make her feel like a real princess. The realization was both embarrassing and enlightening. Catherine finished reading to the children, completed the rest of her hospital visit, and spent the entire car ride back to Kensington Palace thinking about what this insight meant for her next steps. By the time she arrived home, Catherine had made another decision. She was going to speak with William about the necklace, as Charles had suggested, but not to get his permission for her original plan. Instead, she wanted to understand his feelings about his mother's jewelry and get his perspective on her conflicted emotions about living up to Diana's legacy. She found William in their sitting room, reviewing briefing papers for his upcoming trip to Scotland. He looked up as she entered, immediately sensing her serious mood. "How was the hospital visit?" he asked, setting aside his papers. "Fine," Catherine replied, then immediately corrected herself.
Actually, no. It wasn't fine. I mean, the visit itself was fine, but I wasn't fine. I need to talk to you about something.
William gave her his full attention, a gesture that Catherine never took for granted despite their years of marriage. Even with all his obligations and pressures, William had always made time to really listen when she needed to talk. I spoke with your father yesterday about borrowing one of your mother's necklaces, Catherine began, deciding to approach the subject directly rather than dancing around it.
It didn't go well.
William's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't interrupt as Catherine explained her feelings about Diana's legacy, her visit to the treasure room, and her awkward conversation with Charles. She told him about learning that Harry might have wanted the same necklace, about the complicated ownership questions surrounding Diana's jewelry, and about Charles's gentle but firm refusal of her request. When she finished, William was quiet for a long moment. Catherine watched his face carefully, trying to read his reaction, but his expression remained neutral, a skill he had perfected over years of public life.
Which necklace specifically? William asked finally.
Catherine described the sapphire and diamond piece in detail, and she saw recognition dawn in William's eyes.
I remember that one, he said softly. She wore it to my school play once when I was about 8. I thought she looked like a queen from a storybook.
The tender memory in his voice made Catherine's heart ache. She had been so focused on her own feelings about Diana's legacy that she hadn't fully considered how her request might affect the people who actually remembered Diana as a living, breathing person.
William, I'm sorry, she said quickly. I should have talked to you first before approaching your father. I wasn't thinking clearly about how this might affect you and Harry. William reached over and took her hand. You don't need to apologize for having feelings about my mother's memory. I understand why you're drawn to connecting with her legacy. But, Catherine, you need to know something. You don't need to wear my mother's jewelry to be worthy of being Princess of Wales. His words echoed what Charles had said, but, coming from William, they carried additional weight. This was Diana's son, someone who had loved her deeply and still grieved her loss, telling Catherine that she was enough just as she was. I know that intellectually, Catherine replied. But, emotionally, it's harder. Every day I read comparisons between us, see articles about how I measure up to her memory. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in her shadow, and I thought maybe wearing something that had been hers would help me feel more legitimate. William squeezed her hand gently. You are legitimate, Catherine. You've earned your place through your own actions and dedication. My mother would be proud of what you've accomplished, not because you reminded her of herself, but because you found your own unique way to serve. Catherine felt tears starting to form in her eyes. But, what about the comparisons? What about the pressure to live up to what she represented? The comparisons will always happen, William said honestly. But, they're based on an incomplete picture of who my mother really was. The public saw her grace and glamour, but they didn't see her struggles, her doubts, her bad days. You're being compared to a memory, not a real person. This perspective hadn't occurred to Catherine before, and it shifted something fundamental in her thinking. She had been trying to live up to an idealized version of Diana, not the complex human being that Diana had actually been. Your father mentioned that Harry might have wanted that particular necklace, Catherine said. Did you know about that? William nodded slowly. Harry was always more interested in keeping pieces of mummy than I was. I had different ways of honoring her memory. But, yes, he did express interest in that necklace at one point, though I don't think he's thought about it in years. I feel terrible for not considering that, Catherine admitted. I was so focused on my own feelings that I didn't think about how my actions might affect other people. That's human nature, William replied. When we're struggling with something personal, it's hard to see beyond our own perspective. But, it's also why it's important to talk these things through with family before making decisions. Catherine appreciated his gentle way of making the same point Charles had made, that royal life required more careful consideration of consequences than she had initially given her request. So what do you think I should do? Catherine asked. How do I deal with these feelings about your mother's legacy without causing problems for the family?
William was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through his response carefully. I think the first step is recognizing that you don't need to recreate my mother's approach to being Princess of Wales. You need to find your own approach, one that honors what she accomplished while building something new.
But, how do I do that when everyone keeps comparing us?
By focusing on what you can control, your own actions, your own choices, your own causes. The comparisons will happen regardless, but they become less important when you're confident in your own path. Catherine could see the wisdom in what William was saying, but she still felt drawn to the idea of some kind of tangible connection to Diana's memory.
What about other pieces? She asked tentatively. Your father mentioned that there might be other items that wouldn't be as problematic. Would you be comfortable with me borrowing something else of your mother's occasionally? William considered this carefully.
I think that could work, as long as we choose pieces that don't have complicated histories or emotional significance for Harry.
There are probably items that would achieve what you're looking for without opening old wounds.
The possibility of compromise lifted Catherine's spirits considerably. She might not be able to have the specific necklace she had wanted, but perhaps there was still a way to create the connection she was seeking.
Would you help me identify which pieces might be appropriate? Catherine asked.
Of course, William replied. We could look through the collection together, maybe with Papa's input as well.
That way everyone's comfortable with whatever decision we make.
As they continued talking, Catherine began to feel like she was finding her way toward a solution that honored everyone's feelings while addressing her own needs. It wouldn't be exactly what she had originally envisioned, but it might actually be better, a decision made with input from the whole family rather than something she pursued on her own. The conversation with William had helped Catherine understand that her struggle with Diana's legacy was normal and understandable, but it had also shown her that she needed to approach these issues with more consideration for others. Royal life meant that personal decisions were rarely just personal, they always had wider implications that needed to be carefully considered. As the evening wore on, Catherine found herself feeling more optimistic than she had in days. She might not have gotten the necklace she wanted, but she had gained something more valuable, a better understanding of her own motivations and a clearer path forward for dealing with the complex emotions surrounding her role as Princess of Wales.
The next morning brought unexpected complications that no one in the royal household could have anticipated.
Catherine was having breakfast with the children when her private secretary, Amanda, appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately set off alarm bells.
Your Royal Highness, Amanda said carefully, I'm afraid we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Catherine looked up from helping Louis with his cereal, noting the unusual tension in Amanda's voice.
In the years they had worked together, Amanda had handled countless crises with calm efficiency, so her obvious distress was concerning.
What kind of situation?
Catherine asked, though part of her already suspected it had something to do with her visit to the treasure room 2 days earlier.
There's been a leak to the press, Amanda replied, glancing meaningfully toward the children. Perhaps we could discuss this in your office? Catherine's heart sank.
She quickly arranged for the nanny to take over breakfast duties and followed Amanda down the hallway to her private office, her mind racing with possibilities about what exactly had been leaked and how. Amanda closed the office door behind them and handed Catherine a tablet displaying the morning's online edition of a popular tabloid. The headline made Catherine's blood run cold: Kate's secret quest for Diana's treasures, palace sources reveal princess's emotional plea for late mother-in-law's jewelry. Catherine sank into her chair as she skimmed the article, watching her private moment of vulnerability transformed into sensationalized entertainment for the masses. The article wasn't entirely inaccurate, it correctly identified her visit to the collection room and her conversation with Charles about borrowing Diana's jewelry. But it was filled with dramatic language and speculative details that made the whole situation sound far more scandalous than it had been.
How did they find out? Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. We're not certain yet, Amanda replied.
The article cites palace sources but doesn't name anyone specifically. However, the level of detail suggests that someone with direct knowledge of your conversation with His Majesty spoke to the reporter. The implications hit Catherine like a physical blow. Someone in the royal household, someone she trusted, someone with access to private family conversations, had betrayed that trust for money or attention or whatever motivation drove people to sell royal secrets to the tabloids. What's the palace's official response going to be? Catherine asked, already dreading the answer. The communications team is meeting with His Majesty this morning to discuss strategy, Amanda replied. But, given the sensitive nature of anything involving the late Princess Diana, this is likely to generate significant media attention regardless of how we respond. Catherine felt a wave of nausea wash over her. What had started as a private emotional moment had become public fodder, and she knew from experience that once a story like this broke, it would be dissected and analyzed and speculated about for days or even weeks. Her phone buzzed with a text message from William. Saw the story. Coming home now. We'll get through this together. The fact that William had already seen the article meant it was spreading quickly through social media and other news outlets. Catherine imagined royal correspondents around the world already preparing their own versions of the story, each adding their own spin and speculation to the basic facts. Within an hour, Catherine's worst fears were confirmed. The story had been picked up by major newspapers, broadcast news programs, and countless social media accounts. The hashtag Kate vs. Diana was trending on multiple platforms, with people debating everything from Catherine's motives to the appropriateness of her request to whether she was trying to replace Diana or honor her memory. William arrived home to find Catherine in her office, staring at her laptop screen as negative comments poured in from around the world. She looked up as he entered, and he could see the devastation in her eyes. "I've destroyed everything," she said quietly. "All the work I've done to build my own reputation, all the respect I've earned, it's all gone because I wanted to wear a necklace." William crossed the room quickly and pulled her into his arms. "You haven't destroyed anything, Catherine. This will pass, like all the other media storms we've weathered." "But, this is different," Catherine protested. "This is about your mother. People are saying I'm trying to replace her, that I'm jealous of her memory, that I'm not worthy of being Princess of Wales. And, the worst part is, maybe some of it's true." William held her tighter. "None of that is true, and you know it. You're being attacked by people who don't know you and don't understand the real situation. Don't let them define who you are." Before Catherine could respond, Amanda appeared in the doorway again, looking even more strained than before. "Your Royal Highnesses, I'm afraid the situation has escalated," she announced. "His Majesty would like to see you both immediately." The walk to Charles's office felt like the longest journey Catherine had ever taken. She could feel the weight of every palace staff member's eyes on her as they passed, wondering if any of them were the source of the leak, wondering what they thought of her now that her private struggles had become public entertainment. Charles was waiting for them with his private secretary and the head of royal communications. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and Catherine could immediately tell that this was being treated as a serious crisis rather than a minor media inconvenience. "Catherine, William," Charles said as they entered, his voice carrying a formal tone that Catherine hadn't heard him use with her before. "I think you're both aware of why we need to talk." Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. "The communications team has been fielding calls all morning," Charles continued. "The story is being picked up internationally, and there are already requests for official statements from multiple news organizations." The head of communications, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria, stepped forward with a folder of documents. "We're recommending a strategy of minimal response," Victoria explained. "The more we say, the more fuel we give to the story. A brief statement acknowledging that the Princess of Wales has great respect for the late Princess Diana's memory, and that private family conversations should remain private, should suffice." Catherine appreciated the measured approach, but she could see from the expressions around the room that there was more to discuss. However, Victoria continued, we do need to address the potential long-term implications of this story. There are already opinion pieces being written about the Princess of Wales's relationship with her predecessor's legacy, and we anticipate this will be a talking point for some time.
Charles looked directly at Catherine. I want you to understand that I don't blame you for any of this. Your feelings about Diana's memory are natural and understandable.
But this situation has highlighted some of the challenges we face when private family matters become public.
Catherine finally found her voice.
I'm so sorry, Papa. I never intended for any of this to become public. I should have been more careful, more thoughtful about the implications of my request.
You have nothing to apologize for, Charles replied, his voice softening slightly.
You came to me with honest feelings and a reasonable request.
The fact that someone violated our privacy is not your fault.
The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from potential media responses to security concerns to the impact this might have on upcoming royal engagements. Throughout it all, Catherine felt like she was watching her life being dissected and analyzed, reduced to talking points and strategic considerations. As they prepared to leave, Charles asked to speak with Catherine privately for a moment. William squeezed her hand reassuringly before stepping out of the office with the others.
Catherine, Charles said once they were alone, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything about how the family views you or your contributions.
You are a valued member of this family, and one media storm isn't going to change that.
But people are saying such horrible things, Catherine replied. They're questioning my motives, my character, my worthiness to carry Diana's title. People said horrible things about Diana too, when she was alive, Charles reminded her gently.
The media builds people up and tears them down as it suits their purposes. Your worth isn't determined by what strangers write about you in newspapers or post on social media.
Catherine nodded, though she knew it would take time for her to truly believe that again.
There is one thing we need to discuss, though, Charles continued.
Given the current situation, I think it would be wise to postpone any decisions about Diana's jewelry until the media attention dies down.
Any movement on that front now would only add fuel to the fire. Catherine had expected this, but it still stung. Her simple request for a connection to Diana's memory had not only been denied, but had now created a situation that made any future requests virtually impossible.
I understand, she said quietly.
As Catherine left Charles's office, she felt like she was walking through a different world than the one she had inhabited just 3 days earlier. The palace corridors looked the same, the staff smiled at her with the same professional courtesy, but everything felt changed by the knowledge that her private struggles were now public property. The rest of the day passed in a blur of damage control meetings, revised schedules, and careful conversations with staff about maintaining privacy going forward. Catherine went through the motions of her royal duties, but part of her mind was always elsewhere, wondering who had betrayed her trust and why. That evening, as she was putting the children to bed, Charlotte asked her why there were so many photographers outside their house. Sometimes people are very interested in what princesses do, Catherine explained, choosing her words carefully.
Are you in trouble? Charlotte asked with the directness that only children possess. Catherine considered the question seriously. Was she in trouble?
Not officially, perhaps, but the situation had certainly complicated her life in ways she was still trying to understand.
No, sweetheart, she said finally. Sometimes people just like to talk about things that aren't really their business.
As Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed, she realized that her daughter's innocent question had highlighted something important. She wasn't actually in trouble, she had done nothing wrong. She had experienced human emotions, made a reasonable request, and been betrayed by someone she had trusted. The shame and embarrassment she was feeling weren't really hers to carry. The realization didn't make the media scrutiny any easier to bear, but it did help Catherine begin to separate what was her responsibility from what belonged to others. She couldn't control what people wrote about her or how they interpreted her actions, but she could control how she responded to the situation and what she chose to learn from it. As she prepared for bed that night, Catherine found herself thinking not about the necklace she had wanted, but about the strength she was discovering she possessed. Diana had faced far worse media storms than this one, and she had survived them with grace. Perhaps that was the real legacy Catherine needed to embrace, not the jewelry or the fashion choices, but the resilience and dignity that Diana had shown in the face of overwhelming public scrutiny. 3 weeks had passed since the media storm erupted, and Catherine was beginning to see the first signs that the intense scrutiny might finally be starting to fade. The initial wave of sensationalized articles had given way to more thoughtful pieces about the pressures facing modern royals, and the hashtags that had dominated social media were being replaced by newer controversies and trending topics. The investigation into the source of the leak had yielded results, though not the kind Catherine had expected. It turned out that the information hadn't come from a deliberate betrayal by a trusted staff member, but rather from a casual conversation overheard by a temporary worker who had been helping with inventory management in the treasure room. The person hadn't even realized the significance of what they had heard until they mentioned it to a friend, who happened to know someone who worked for the tabloids. The revelation was both relieving and disturbing. Catherine felt better knowing that no one had intentionally violated her trust, but the incident highlighted just how vulnerable private conversations could be within the sprawling royal household. It was a lesson about the constant vigilance required when living in the public eye, something Diana had learned the hard way many times over. Catherine was in her office reviewing plans for an upcoming visit to a women's shelter when Amanda knocked on her door with an expression that Catherine had learned to read carefully. Over the past weeks, Amanda had become expert at gauging whether incoming news was likely to be positive or negative, and today she looked cautiously optimistic. "Your Royal Highness," Amanda said, "His Majesty would like to see you this afternoon, if your schedule permits. He mentioned that he has something he'd like to discuss with you privately." Catherine felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. While her relationship with Charles had remained warm despite the media crisis, formal requests for private meetings still made her wonder what new complications might be emerging. "Of course," Catherine replied. "Did he give any indication what this is about?" Amanda smiled slightly. "He just said it was a personal matter that he thought you'd find interesting." The mysterious nature of the request occupied Catherine's thoughts for the rest of the morning. She found herself speculating about what Charles might want to discuss, ranging from new royal duties to family matters to perhaps some development related to the jewelry situation. When Catherine arrived at Charles's study that afternoon, she was surprised to find William waiting there as well. Both men stood as she entered, and she could see something almost ceremonial in their posture. "Catherine, my dear," Charles said warmly, "thank you for making time to see us. Please, have a seat." Catherine settled into the familiar chair across from Charles's desk, looking between her husband and father-in-law with curiosity and slight apprehension. "The past few weeks have been challenging for all of us," Charles began, "but they've also given me an opportunity to reflect on some important matters. Your request for Diana's necklace, and everything that followed from it, has made me think more deeply about how we handle family heirlooms and memory within the royal family." Catherine nodded, not sure where this was leading but sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "William and I have had several conversations about Diana's jewelry and about your feelings regarding her legacy," Charles continued. "We've also spoken with Harry, who wanted to be part of these discussions even though he couldn't be here today." The mention of Harry surprised Catherine. She knew that William had reached out to his brother after the media story broke, but she hadn't known that Harry was being included in ongoing conversations about the situation. "What we've come to realize," William said, picking up the thread, "is that my mother's possessions have been treated as museum pieces for too long. They're beautiful and meaningful objects that should be part of our family's ongoing life, not just stored away for special occasions." Charles opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a small velvet box that Catherine immediately recognized as coming from the royal jewelry collection. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized what this might mean. "Catherine," Charles said, "your desire to connect with Diana's memory was neither inappropriate nor unreasonable. In fact, it made us all realize that we've been so focused on preserving her memory that we may have forgotten to let it live and grow with our family. He extended the velvet box toward Catherine, who accepted it with trembling hands. This isn't the sapphire necklace you originally asked about, William explained gently. That piece is going to remain in the collection for now, for reasons we discussed. But this is something that we think might mean even more to you. Catherine opened the box to reveal a delicate gold bracelet set with small diamonds and sapphires. It was beautiful but understated, elegant without being ostentatious. More importantly, it felt somehow familiar, though Catherine was certain she had never seen it before. My mother wore that bracelet to my christening, William said softly. She also wore it to Harry's first day of school, to my graduation from university, and to many other important family moments. It wasn't her most famous piece, but it was one of her favorites for personal occasions. Catherine looked up from the bracelet with tears in her eyes. This was so much more meaningful than the necklace she had originally requested. Instead of a piece that would make headlines and invite comparisons, this was something intimate and personal, connected to the private moments of Diana's life as a mother. William suggested this particular piece, Charles added, because he thought it represented what you were really looking for, a tangible connection to Diana's role as a loving mother and devoted family member, rather than her public persona as a fashion icon. Catherine realized that William had understood her motivations better than she had understood them herself. She hadn't really wanted to wear Diana's glamorous jewelry to recreate famous photographs. She had wanted to feel connected to Diana as a woman, as a mother, as someone who had loved her children and tried to navigate the complex demands of royal life. There are no complicated ownership issues with this piece, Charles explained. It was always clearly part of Diana's personal collection, and both William and Harry are in complete agreement that it should be yours to wear whenever you choose. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of this gesture and what it represented. This wasn't just about giving her a piece of jewelry, it was about officially welcoming her into the family's most private circle, the space where Diana's memory lived not as a public icon but as a beloved family member. Thank you, Catherine finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. This means more to me than I can possibly express. William came around the desk to sit beside her. We want you to know that you don't need our jewelry or our permission to be worthy of carrying on my mother's legacy. But, if wearing something of hers helps you feel connected to that legacy, then, we want to support that connection. Charles nodded in agreement. Diana's greatest legacy wasn't her fashion sense or her public image, it was her love for her family and her dedication to causes that mattered to her. Those are the qualities you've already embodied in your own royal service. Catherine looked down at the bracelet again, imagining Diana fastening it around her wrist before important family moments, choosing it because it was beautiful but not overwhelming, elegant but not showy. It was perfect for the woman Diana had been when she wasn't performing for the cameras, just a mother who wanted to look nice for her children's important days. I'd like to wear it to Charlotte's school concert next week, Catherine said. If that would be appropriate. Both men smiled warmly. That would be perfect, William replied. Exactly the kind of occasion Mummy would have chosen it for. As they continued talking, Catherine began to understand that this resolution was about much more than jewelry. It was about finding a way to honor the past while moving forward, about integrating Diana's memory into the ongoing life of the royal family rather than keeping it locked away in a vault. The media attention from the previous weeks had been painful, but it had also forced all of them to examine their assumptions about how royal traditions should evolve. Catherine's simple request for a connection to Diana's memory had opened up larger conversations about how the family dealt with loss, legacy, and the complex emotions that came with carrying on someone else's work. There's one more thing, Charles said as their conversation began to wind down. The communications team has prepared a statement about this gift, if you're comfortable with making it public. Nothing dramatic, just a simple announcement that you've been given a piece of Diana's jewelry to wear for family occasions. Catherine considered this carefully. Part of her wanted to keep this moment private, to protect it from the commentary and analysis that any public announcement would inevitably generate. But she also recognized the value of being transparent, of showing the public that the royal family could handle these sensitive matters with grace and thoughtfulness. "I think a simple statement would be appropriate," she decided. "People deserve to know that this situation has been resolved positively, and it might help put some of the speculation to rest." William squeezed her hand approvingly. "I think that's wise. And, Catherine, I want you to know how proud I am of how you've handled this whole situation. It can't have been easy dealing with all the criticism and speculation." "I've learned a lot about myself and about this family," Catherine replied. "Not all of it was comfortable to learn, but I'm grateful for the growth that came from it." As Catherine prepared to leave, Charles stood and walked around his desk to give her a warm embrace, something he had never done in such a formal setting before. "Welcome to the family, my dear," he said quietly. "Not that you weren't already a cherished member, but this feels like another level of belonging." Catherine understood what he meant. This wasn't just about receiving a gift of jewelry, it was about being trusted with the family's most precious memories, about being seen as someone worthy of carrying Diana's legacy forward into the future. When Catherine arrived home that evening, she found William in their sitting room with the children, helping them with homework. She showed them the bracelet, explaining that it had belonged to their grandmother Diana and that she would be wearing it to special family events. "It's pretty," Charlotte observed with the straightforward honesty of a child. "Granny Diana had good taste." "Yes, she did," Catherine agreed, fastening the bracelet around her wrist and admiring how it caught the light. "And now we can keep her good taste as part of our family." As Catherine tucked the children into bed that night, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning 3 weeks earlier when she had first stood in front of Diana's jewelry case. She had gotten something even better than what she had originally requested, not just a beautiful piece of jewelry, but a deeper understanding of her place within the royal family and a more mature relationship with Diana's memory. The sapphire necklace still gleamed in its case in the treasure room, and perhaps someday the circumstances would be right for Catherine to borrow it for a special occasion. But, for now, she had something much more meaningful, a simple gold bracelet that connected her not to Diana the icon, but to Diana the mother, the woman who had loved her children and wanted to be present for their important moments. Catherine looked at herself in the mirror that night, the bracelet glinting softly on her wrist, and realized that she no longer felt like she was living in Diana's shadow. Instead, she felt like she was walking beside her memory, carrying it forward into whatever challenges and joys the future might bring.